Hey, welcome back to the channel. This is Chris Morris, and let me ask you a question. If Superman can use his superpowers to, I don't know, save people from burning buildings, and Batman can use his billions to stop crime in Gotham, and Captain America can throw his shield to prevent people from getting shot, and every comic book hero can use their superpowers to prevent people from getting hurt. Why can not God in the real world use his superpowers to, I don't know, prevent, say, buildings from collapsing? Now, of course, the Christian's response is he can do those things, but this gets at one of the issues in the problem of evil, which is that if God is so powerful, why can't he or doesn't he use his power to save people, to prevent bad things from happening? Now, there are two ways this is usually dealt with. The first is to address the freedom idea, the idea that God doesn't want to interrupt people's freedom. And if he uses his power in such a way to prevent people from doing bad things, then therefore this would be a denial of free will. We will look at that in our next video on this subject. But for now, I want to look at the other way, which is to redefine omnipotence so that it doesn't mean that God is all powerful. And to that, let me ask you a question. What does it mean for God to be all-powerful? Now, there are three general reasons that we should start with omnipotence when we want to consider the problem of evil. The first reason is what I suggested just a moment ago, which is that it is typically where people start when dealing with the problem of evil. They attempt to redefine omnipotence, usually around freedom, but the point even there is to discuss what it really means to be omnipotent. The second reason is that the argument typically begins with a statement of God's power. The first premise, as we've seen, is that if God is all-powerful, he is capable of or can stop all evil. And then the third reason is the Bible actually seems to start here itself. Genesis chapter 1, verse 1 says, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." And if nothing else, Genesis 1:1 can be taken as a statement of God's omnipotence, that he is powerful enough to bring the entire world into existence. Now, if the Bible starts with the claim of omnipotence, if it begins the entire biblical story with a discussion of God's power, I suggest that perhaps that means that omnipotence is part of the very definition of what it means to be God. In fact, maybe that's part of the first thing we need to understand about what kind of thing God is. But that can also lead to some misconceptions. The first misconception I think people can easily fall into is they define being omnipotent or all-powerful as the ability to do absolutely anything. Now, this is widely discussed among philosophers and commenters and theologians and preachers and YouTubers, but there are some things that we simply do not need to say God is capable of doing. He cannot create a square circle. It's just a meaningless sentence. It doesn't actually mean anything. He can't create a rock so big he can't lift it. He can't remember a time that he didn't know everything, and he can't will himself out of existence. But none of this should be taken as a limitation on God's power. C.S. Lewis discussed this in his book, The Problem of Pain, where he said that God's omnipotence means the power to do all that is intrinsically possible, not to do the intrinsically impossible. He wanted to say you may attribute to him miracles, but not nonsense. This is not to limit his power. If you choose to say God can create free creatures and at the same time withhold free will from them, you have not succeeded in saying anything about God. Meaningless combination of words do not successfully acquire meaning simply because we prefix them with the words God can. It remains true that all things are possible with God. The intrinsic impossibilities are not things but non-entities. It is no more possible for God than for the weakest of his creatures to carry out both two mutually exclusive alternatives, not because his power meets an obstacle, but because nonsense remains nonsense even when we talk about God. And this is a widely recognized principle. A secular philosopher, the name of Noam Chomsky, composed back in the 50s this sentence: "Colorless green ideas sleep furiously." Now, you know what every word in that sentence means, and it is grammatically correct, and yet you probably can immediately see this sentence actually is meaningless. And many ideas about God that we can say, in fact, are just nonsense. The words seem to make perfectly logical sense, and yet upon analysis, they in fact don't mean anything at all. And such is the case, for example, with God creating rocks so big he can't lift it, or asking God to create square circles. These simply are intrinsic impossibilities. So again, we're not saying that God can do absolutely anything. He can do anything that is intrinsically possible. Now, that is a widely understood principle, I think. However, the second misconception is perhaps a little less well understood, and this is the tendency to see God as something like a cosmic Superman. I began this video, in fact, with this very misconception in mind. I asked, if Superman can save everyone, why can't God? On this notion, power is the same thing that you and I have, only at a different level. Just as human beings and superheroes have power, God has the same thing, only more of it. But one of the things that's really important for us to understand is that the Bible does not, in fact, present God's power as of the same sort of thing as us. God does not have just more power than we do, as if he were a cosmic Superman. Rather, God's power is something altogether different. So what is then omnipotence? It is really this, which is what we began with Genesis 1:1. Omnipotence is the ability to bring into existence what is or what could be. If something cannot be brought into existence, if it's simply not a thing, then not even God can bring into existence, because it's not a thing capable of being brought into existence. But anything that can be done is to say that God would be the thing to bring it into existence. Again, Genesis 1:1 begins there. John 1:3 has a similar argument. It says, through him, talking about Jesus here, all things are made, and without him, nothing was made that has been made. By the way, there's an implied argument for God's existence here, which we will cover in another video. So then if we understand what omnipotence is, this notion of bringing into being that which is, then we can ask some meaningful questions. First would be, can God bring evil into existence? And the short answer here is simply going to be no. The reason God cannot bring evil into existence is because evil actually doesn't exist as a thing. And let me show you what I mean. I have three silly pictures here. The first is a very poorly drawn circle. Notice this circle is lacking something. It's not a very good circle. It is, you might say, a bad circle. I have a picture of a tree that is it's a dead tree. It's not producing any fruit. We might call it a bad tree. And we have a picture of a very bad man. I'm sure you know who that particular guy is. Now, what all three of these bad or evil things have in common is they're missing something they ought to have by nature. Circles ought to have a particular shape, and to the extent that it deviates from that shape, it is a bad circle. It lacks something it should have. Certain kinds of trees ought to produce certain kinds of fruit. That's why an apple tree that doesn't produce apples is going to be a bad apple tree. And this is the reason, by the way, for arguments we'll get to later on, why bad people are actually bad, because by nature we are supposed to be rational, good people, and when you deviate from that, you're missing something you're supposed to have. Evil then is an absence of a good. It's not actually a thing in and of itself, just like darkness is the absence of light, cold is the absence of heat. In just a very similar way, evil is simply the absence of a good that ought to be there. And so then God can't bring evil into existence, because evil is not the kind of thing that ought to be brought into existence. But then that raises a second question, which is, well, then can God bring imperfect things into existence? Because it is very evident there are many imperfect things in the world all around us, and clearly God has brought them into existence. Why not simply bring perfect things into existence? Now, this, I think, is a very fair question. The way to answer this is, of course, God brings things into existence, but what happens is, because of the order of the creation which he has decided to bring into the world, there are imperfections. So, for example, if I choose to eat an apple, then the apple is going to lose something it ought to have, namely the body, the apple. As I consume it, it's as bad for the apple, it's good for me. Or suppose as the universe operates according to certain laws of nature, I get in the way of those laws of nature. And through no maliciousness, it just so happens that I get hurt. I fall and I scrape my knee, for instance. So it's worth noting that it's the regularity, the way in which the universe normally works, that in fact can bring harm or evil to me. And so in a perhaps a bit of an ironic way, the very order of the world is what can in some ways bring evil into a finite, limited world such as this. I think this principle of order is also deeply embedded in Genesis chapter 1, because while it does speak of God bringing the world into existence, the entire chapter is about God establishing order. Now, the claim at this point might be that, well, why doesn't God create a world in which this kind of order doesn't exist? And notice what we're doing now. We're now complaining that God has created an orderly universe. And that would seem to be an odd argument to make against God if we're trying to charge him with evil. Another argument I'm about to ask is, well, what about the next life, heaven or whatever? Is there not going to be order there? And here I would simply point you to where the scriptures speak about the new heavens and the earth. It's obviously going to be very different than it is now. In fact, what's really interesting is if you look at the biblical witness, the new order, the new creation is going to be built in some ways on the old. It is through Christ's death and resurrection, which speaks to his conquering of death, the conquering of evil, out of which he's going to bring this new incorruptible order. And so that's going to bring us to the third and final question, which is, why not at least prevent some evils? And the answer here is maybe he has. The biblical witness is that God has prevented a great many number of evils. I have the picture there of Daniel in the lion's den. And who knows how many things that God has intervened on to prevent bad or evil things from happening. We will never know precisely because God prevented them. But second of all, let's go back to our principle of order. If God were to constantly be intervening and always stopping evil, then what kind of world would that be? It would be a chaotic, disorderly world. And then you couldn't be expected to grow as a person, to learn from mistakes and to become wiser, if you will. And in fact, that might lead us to a third possibility, which is the worst implication, would be that we might learn something false about the universe. The world might actually appear as a magic trick. Watch, I'll demonstrate in a silly way. Through the magic of camera editing, you know that that didn't just pop into existence out of nothing. In fact, we don't live in a world where that happens. But if every single time something bad were to happen, God were to magically intervene, we might come to understand and think that there were actual laws in the universe that weren't really there, that would cause streets to turn into cushions just before that we hit them, or cause coffee cups to appear in our hands full of lovely coffee just as soon as we got thirsty. And in fact, we would not realize that God was the one doing those things. It would cause us to think wrong things about the universe. And God, it seems to be deeply interested in us coming to know the truth. So bottom line, is God powerful enough to prevent evil? The answer is yes, and we should not try to redefine omnipotence away such that we can say, oh, well, God really can't for this or that reason. In fact, he can. But it does seem that, first of all, he will ultimately create a world in which there is no evil, but he has chosen to create a world that is corruptible, a world that there are, which goods can compete. And that competition of goods means that one might lose another, which is what we call evil. People they might die sadly as buildings fall because gravity works. And so I think deep in this, we might see some potential reasons as to why God might choose to allow imperfections and evils to exist in this world. But I don't think redefining the first premise gets us away from the problem of evil. I do think what it does is get us much closer to understanding what God actually is. And again, he is at his core that which brings all good of all kinds into the universe, including the order in your life. So let me close with a final quick bit of a theological reflection. Every good and perfect gift comes down from the Father of lights, according to James. And this is deeply true, not only at a biblical level, but on a philosophical and theological level as well. God is the one who brings good in your life. So as we consider the problem of evil, let us remember that yes, there's evil in the world, but all of the good is only there because God is the one bringing it into existence. Any questions, comments, cries of outrage, feel free to leave them in the comments below, and we'll continue the conversation next time. May you be richly blessed.